Keanu Reeves steps out of his car, looking up at the familiar building of Peoria Boys High School. The air is thick with memories, both good and bad. He's come to visit, not expecting anything unusual, just to relive the past. But as he walks through the hallways, something unexpected happens. He spots Carlos Ramirez, the same janitor who had quietly protected him from bullies decades ago. Now at 80 years old, Carlos is still mopping floors. Keanu can't believe it. What he thought was just a casual visit to his old school turns into a life-changing moment. Keanu Reeves stood outside Peoria Boys High School, staring up at the familiar red brick walls. It had been nearly 40 years since he walked these halls as a teenager, and the memories flooded back. Some of them were happy, days spent dreaming about the future, making friends and learning new things. But others were painful, moments of being bullied and feeling alone, unsure of where he fit in the world. Now, as a successful adult, Keanu couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions as he stood at the same school that had shaped him in so many ways. He was here for a quick visit. He didn't want any fanfare or attention, just a quiet walk through the school to see how it had changed. His assistant, Talia, walked beside him, checking her watch and reminding him of the tight schedule they had. "We're running a bit late, Mr. Reeves," she said, glancing at her phone. "The education minister is expecting you in Cape Town by 4. Keanu nodded. "It won't take long. I just want to see the place one last time before we announce the new program." He smiled, trying to shake off the strange feeling settling in his chest. As they entered the school, Keanu felt as if he had stepped back in time. The same tall windows, the same echoing hallways, and that unmistakable smell, polish and chalk dust, that brought him right back to his teenage years. It was like he had never left. He walked slowly, letting the memories wash over him. There was the math classroom where he'd struggled to keep up with the other kids, the library where he'd hidden away to avoid the bullies, and the science wing where he first discovered his love for physics. Every corner of the school held a piece of his past. But then, as he rounded a corner, he heard the soft squeak of a mop on the floor. Keanu paused and looked down the hall. There, slowly mopping the floor, was a familiar figure. It was Carlos Ramirez, the school janitor. Keanu blinked, wondering if he was seeing things. But no, it was him, Carlos, the same man who had worked at the school when Keanu was a student. He was now 80 years old, still doing the same job he had done for years. Keanu walked closer, his heart skipping a beat. He couldn't believe it. After all these years, Carlos was still here, cleaning the school that had been his life for so long. He remembered how Carlos had always been there when Keanu needed him most, when the bullying got too bad, when he just needed someone to talk to. Carlos had never asked for anything in return. He had just been there, a quiet guardian in the background. "Carlos," Keanu called out, his voice thick with emotion. The old man looked up, squinting at him. When he recognized Keanu, his face lit up with surprise. "Young Mr. Reeves? Is that really you?" Keanu smiled, feeling a mix of nostalgia and gratitude. "It's me, Carlos. But I'm not so young anymore." The two men stood there for a moment, silently taking each other in. Keanu's mind raced. He had thought he was just revisiting his past, but what he found here was something more. Something that would change his perspective on kindness, impact, and the importance of the people we often overlook. Keanu walked through the familiar hallways of Peoria Boys High School, a rush of memories filling his mind. It felt as though he had stepped into the past. The old wooden doors, the tall windows letting in the afternoon light, and the unmistakable smell of polish and chalk dust, it was all the same. He could almost hear the echoes of the students' laughter and the sound of his own footsteps as he wandered these halls years ago. As he strolled down the corridors, Keanu couldn't help but feel nostalgic. He remembered his teenage years, how challenging they had been. The feelings of being out of place, the bullying that had made him feel small and invisible. But there were also the moments of discovery, when he found his love for science and engineering. Those were the moments that had shaped him into the person he was today. Keanu paused by the library, a place that had been his refuge during those difficult days. He had spent many lunches here, away from the teasing and the pressure. He ran his fingers along the wall, feeling the bumps in the paint, just like he did when he was a teenager. The place hadn't changed much, but Keanu certainly had. He had gone from a lonely teenager to a successful man, and yet he still felt a connection to this place. As he continued his walk through the school, Keanu turned down a hallway leading to the science wing. This was where he had spent hours after class, learning about physics and falling in love with the subject that would later define his career. It was here that he had first learned that knowledge could be a way out, a path to a better future. But as Keanu rounded the corner, something caught his attention. He heard the soft squeak of a mop on the floor. It was the unmistakable sound of someone cleaning, and it instantly brought him back to his school days. He looked down the hall and there, slowly mopping the floor, was a man who looked very familiar. At first, Keanu thought it was just his imagination, but then he saw the gray-green uniform. It was the janitor, Mr. Vargas, the same man who had worked at the school when Keanu was a student. Keanu blinked in disbelief. Mr. Vargas had always been there, quietly doing his job, but Keanu had never fully appreciated him back then. He had been so caught up in his own struggles that he hadn't noticed the quiet kindness of this man. Keanu's heart skipped a beat as he walked closer. He realized that the man before him wasn't just any janitor, this was the man who had protected him during his toughest days. When Keanu had been cornered by bullies in the hallways, it had always been Mr. Vargas who appeared out of nowhere, quietly sweeping near the library or walking by when things got too rough. He had never asked for anything in return, just silently showing up at the right moments. Now, as Keanu stood before him, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Mr. Vargas was still here, still working at the school despite being at least 80 years old. His back was bent with age and his knees looked painful as he moved slowly across the floor, but there he was, still doing the same job he had done for decades. Keanu felt a deep sense of gratitude and surprise. This man had protected him when he was a lonely teenager, and now he saw that he was still doing the same for the new generation of students. Keanu's chest tightened as he realized that Mr. Vargas had spent his entire life caring for others, without ever seeking the recognition he deserved. This man, Keanu thought, has been quietly changing lives for so many years. And now I see him still working hard, still helping, still giving. How could I have not seen this before? Keanu took a deep breath, stepping closer to Mr. Vargas. The man had noticed him too, and there was a moment of silence between them. Mr. Vargas squinted at him for a moment, then his eyes widened in recognition. "Young Mr. Reeves?" Mr. Vargas said in a hoarse voice, his surprise clear. "Is it really you?" Keanu smiled, feeling a rush of emotion. "Yes, it's me, Carlos. But I'm not so young anymore," he said with a chuckle, trying to mask the deep gratitude he felt. Mr. Vargas leaned on his mop and gave a slow, knowing smile. "You've done well for yourself, young man. I've seen it on the news. Rockets and electric cars, eh? Big things." Keanu nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of the years. "I never thought I'd see you again," he said, his voice soft. Mr. Vargas gave a shrug and smiled again, though it was a smile that carried years of hard work and wisdom. "Where else would I go, Mr. Reeves? This place. It's been my home for 52 years. I've seen a lot of young faces come and go." Keanu looked at him, stunned by the realization that this man, who had meant so much to him all those years ago, had spent his entire life in this very school. He had never left, never asked for more. All the while, he had been quietly serving the students and the school, with no recognition and little reward. As Keanu stood there, memories from his teenage years began to flood back. He remembered the bullying, how it seemed like no one would help him. There were days when the older boys would shove him into lockers, call him names and make him feel worthless. It felt like no one noticed, no one cared. Keanu had often felt small, invisible in the crowd, trying to hide his tears behind his textbooks. But then, out of nowhere, Mr. Vargas would appear. Keanu remembered a specific day, one that had stayed with him all these years. It was during his second year at Peoria Boys High School. A group of older boys had cornered him in the bathroom, laughing as they took his backpack. They were about to dunk his head into the toilet when the door suddenly opened. Mr. Vargas had walked in, mop in hand, casually asking the boys if they had made a mess in there. The boys, startled, quickly dropped Keanu's backpack and scattered. Mr. Vargas didn't even look at him, just went about his cleaning as though nothing had happened. The next day, Keanu had found Mr. Vargas cleaning near the library, where he often went to escape from the chaos. The janitor had never said a word about what had happened, but every time the bullies were around, Mr. Vargas seemed to be there, quietly mopping the floors and watching over him. It had meant everything to Keanu. Now, standing before Mr. Vargas, Keanu felt a deep sense of regret. "I never truly saw you, Mr. Vargas," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "You were the one who showed me kindness when no one else did. You protected me when I needed it the most, and I didn't even know how to thank you for that back then." Mr. Vargas simply smiled, shaking his head. "I was just doing what needed to be done. You were a good kid, Mr. Reeves. You just needed a little help like we all do sometimes." Keanu looked at him, his chest tight with gratitude. He had been so focused on his own struggles as a teenager, so absorbed in his dreams of success, that he hadn't realized the quiet sacrifices made by the people around him. Mr. Vargas had spent his entire life here, never asking for praise, never seeking recognition, just quietly doing his part to help others. And now, Keanu understood just how much that had meant, not only to him but to every student who had walked through these halls. "You gave so much to this school, Mr. Vargas," Keanu said softly. "And I didn't even notice. You should have been recognized long ago." Mr. Vargas just shrugged, his humble nature shining through. "I don't need recognition, Mr. Reeves. I've seen enough in my life to know what matters." But Keanu knew that this man who had quietly changed so many lives deserved more than just silence. He deserved to be seen. And Keanu was determined to make sure that happened. Keanu stood silently for a moment, his mind racing as he looked at Carlos. The old man bent over his mop, moved slowly, each step seeming to cause him pain. His knees, which had clearly suffered from years of hard work, seemed to make every movement a struggle. But despite the pain, Carlos continued his job, cleaning the school that had been his home for over 5 decades. Keanu couldn't shake the thought that kept repeating in his mind: how could someone who had given so much still be working for such a small paycheck? The man had spent his entire life in this school, quietly taking care of it, protecting students and showing kindness to those who needed it the most. He had never asked for much in return, only a small salary and the satisfaction of doing his job well. Yet here he was, at 80 years old, still mopping the floors, still working long hours despite his pain. As Keanu watched Carlos, a wave of guilt washed over him. He had been successful beyond his wildest dreams, building companies, launching rockets, and changing the world in so many ways. But all this success had come at a cost. He had been so focused on his own goals that he had never truly noticed the people who had quietly supported him along the way. Carlos had been one of those people. He had protected Keanu when he was just a lonely teenager, offered small acts of kindness without ever expecting anything in return. And now, after all these years, Carlos was still here, still doing the same job, and yet had never been given the recognition or support he truly deserved. Keanu's heart ached as he realized the depth of Carlos' sacrifices. This man had given his life to the school, to the students, and yet he had been left behind, his contributions unnoticed and unappreciated. Keanu couldn't understand how this could happen. How could someone so selfless, so dedicated, still be struggling at the end of his life, in pain and without the recognition he deserved? "I can't let him spend his final years in pain and obscurity," Keanu thought to himself. A deep sense of resolve began to build inside him. There had to be something more he could do. He couldn't just walk away from this moment, knowing that Carlos had given so much and received so little in return. As he stood there watching the old man work, Keanu made a silent vow. He would help Carlos. He would find a way to make sure that this man's life was honored, that he could live out his final years in comfort and with dignity. Carlos had spent a lifetime giving to others. Now it was time for Keanu to give back. The more Keanu thought about it, the more determined he became. He couldn't let Carlos continue to suffer when there was so much he could do to help. There had to be a way to make things right, to ensure that Carlos was not only seen but also supported. Keanu knew that it wasn't just about giving money or charity, it was about honoring the quiet, powerful impact that Carlos had made on so many lives. This was just the beginning. Keanu promised himself that he would do whatever it took to help Carlos, to make sure his sacrifices were never forgotten. And in doing so, he would show the world just how much one person's kindness could mean. Keanu stood there, his heart heavy with the realization of how much Carlos had sacrificed. The thought of him still struggling, still working through pain in his 80s, made Keanu's chest tighten. Carlos had given so much to this school, quietly taking care of everything without ever asking for recognition. Now, Keanu knew that it was his turn to give back. As he watched Carlos mop the floor, Keanu made a decision. It was time to do more than just offer him a quick fix or a temporary solution. Keanu wanted to create a legacy for Carlos. A legacy that would honor his lifelong dedication and show the world the value of his work. He turned to Carlos, his voice filled with determination. "Carlos," he said, his words carefully chosen. "I want to make sure you're taken care of. You've given your life to this school and I want to give back." Carlos looked up, surprised by the intensity in Keanu's voice. "What do you mean, Mr. Reeves?" he asked, his tired eyes filled with curiosity. Keanu smiled, his heart full of gratitude for the man who had been there when he needed it most. "You've spent over 50 years taking care of this school and its students. You've quietly shaped the lives of so many. But now it's time for me to help you, to make sure you're recognized for all that you've done." Keanu paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I'm starting something important. A foundation. It will be called the Ramirez Foundation, and its mission will be to support the unsung heroes of education, the janitors, cafeteria workers, bus drivers, and all the people who keep schools running but rarely get the recognition they deserve. Carlos was speechless, his eyes welling up with emotion as he listened to Keanu's words. "But, why me?" he asked softly. "I've just done my job." Keanu shook his head. "No, Carlos. You've done so much more. You've protected students, encouraged them, and helped them without expecting anything in return. Your impact goes far beyond cleaning floors. The world needs to know what you've done, and I'm going to make sure they do." Carlos didn't know what to say, his hands trembling slightly as he held the mop. Keanu continued, his excitement growing. "As part of the foundation, I want to transform the old science wing of this school into something special. It will be called the Carlos Ramirez Innovation Center, a place where students will learn both academic and practical skills that will help them in the real world." Carlos blinked in shock. "You want to name a whole center after me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Keanu nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "Yes, Carlos. I want this to be a place where students learn not only about math and science but also how to solve real-world problems. A place where they learn to fix things, build things, and develop hands-on skills. And I want you to be a part of it, to teach the students, to mentor them, and to continue giving back in a way that honors everything you've done." Carlos's eyes filled with tears, but his smile was full of pride. I don't know what to say." Keanu smiled warmly, placing a hand on Carlos's shoulder. "You don't have to say anything, Carlos. I just want to make sure you're taken care of, that you get the recognition you deserve, and that your legacy lives on for generations to come." In that moment, Keanu knew that this was more than just helping a man who had shown him kindness. It was about creating something lasting, a place where future generations could learn, grow, and remember the impact of quiet heroes like Carlos Ramirez. As Keanu stood there with Carlos, feeling more determined than ever to make a difference in his life, something caught his eye. Carlos had been quietly cleaning, humming softly as he worked, but Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else in this school, something important that tied them together. "Carlos," Keanu began, breaking the silence, "you've always been kind to me, and I can see that your heart has always been here at this school. But there's something else you've been holding on to, isn't there?" Carlos paused for a moment, his eyes flickering with surprise. He looked at Keanu, unsure of what he meant. Keanu could see a slight hesitation in the old man's expression, as if he was guarding a secret. "I don't know what you mean, Mr. Reeves," Carlos replied, his voice soft as he carefully set his mop down. Keanu took a deep breath. "When I was a teenager here, I had a lot of ideas that I was sure no one would ever care about. Some of them seemed too big or too far-fetched, but there was one in particular that stayed with me. My idea for electric car batteries. I remember I worked on it late one night, but I was frustrated and ended up throwing it away." Carlos smiled gently, the kind of smile that came from years of knowing more than he let on. "I remember that night, Mr. Reeves," he said quietly. "You were working in the science room and I found your sketches in the trash." Keanu blinked, his heart pounding as he stared at Carlos. "You kept them?" he asked in disbelief. Carlos nodded slowly. "I knew there was something special about them even if you didn't see it at the time. I thought maybe one day these ideas would mean something." Keanu felt a rush of emotions, surprise, gratitude, and awe. "You saved my dreams, Carlos," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "At the time I thought I was just throwing away some failed ideas, but you saw something in them. You saw potential when I couldn't." Carlos looked down, his eyes glistening with the weight of the years. "I just knew. You were always different, always thinking about things that no one else did. I could see you had a spark and I believed in it. I believed in you." Keanu was speechless for a moment. He had never fully understood how much those simple acts of kindness had meant. Carlos had believed in him when he had no reason to believe in himself. He had kept those sketches, those discarded dreams, because he saw the potential that Keanu had missed. Now, standing before Carlos, Keanu realized that it was time for him to return the favor. "Carlos," he said, his voice full of conviction, "you believed in me when no one else did, and I'm going to make sure your dreams are fulfilled now. You've spent your life helping others, and it's time for me to help you." Keanu paused, the words carrying weight as he spoke them aloud. "Now it's my turn. You've given so much, and I'm going to make sure that your legacy, your work, your kindness, it all gets the recognition it deserves. You've been an unsung hero for too long. It's time for me to help fulfill your dreams." Carlos looked up, tears in his eyes. He didn't say anything, but the emotion in his face spoke volumes. Keanu had just made a promise, not only to Carlos but to the quiet heroes like him everywhere. In the weeks that followed, Carlos underwent knee surgery, finally getting the relief he needed after years of pain. The transformation was incredible. He walked without difficulty for the first time in years, a new energy in his step. Keanu kept his promise to Carlos, helping him transition into his new role as the building steward at the school. This wasn't just a job, it was a chance for Carlos to share his vast knowledge with the students, teaching them practical skills that would help them in the real world. The school also underwent a major renovation, turning the old science wing into the Carlos Ramirez Innovation Center, where students could not only learn academics but also hands-on skills like carpentry and problem-solving. It was a place where ideas came to life just as Carlos had done for so many years, quietly fixing things that no one noticed. Keanu often reflected on how small acts of kindness, like Carlos helping him through his tough school days, had the power to change lives. That one act of protection and care had rippled through time, guiding Keanu to be the person he was today, and now Carlos' legacy was shaping a whole new generation. As this chapter of transformation unfolded, Keanu couldn't help but encourage everyone to think about the invisible heroes in their own lives. People like Carlos who quietly make a difference every day, often without recognition. Sometimes, the people who shape our lives the most are the ones we barely notice. If this story inspired you, take a moment to comment, like, and subscribe. Reflect on the unsung heroes in your life, and don't forget to show them the appreciation they deserve.